Kevin, little Kelsey would have been 22 this December. Her biological father's family says hearing the news about Ray Dawn Smith's commutation hearing scheduled for next week is shocking and unexpected.
If she would have just done the bare necessities to take care of Kelsey, she would still be alive today.
For the time we had with her. But it shouldn't end the way it did. At times it seems like it was 20 years ago, and at times it seems like it was just last week or something.
She was already in her pajamas when the ambulance arrived, barefoot, unconscious, and wearing a pull-up someone had rushed to put on her. They said she had just been napping. But the clock told a different story. By the time first responders reached the quiet home in Meeker, Oklahoma, she had no pulse, no visible bleeding, no signs of a break-in. Just a 2-year-old girl, lifeless on the living room floor, with bruises doctors said did not match the explanations. She was known for twirling in pink dresses, for clutching her Cabbage Patch doll at bedtime. And now, Kelsey Shelton Smith-Briggs was gone. But what if I told you she had been taken to the ER before? That the bruises, the fractures, the cries, they weren't new. What if you learned the state knew and still sent her back? This isn't a story with one villain. It's a story with many adults, each holding a piece of the responsibility, each pointing fingers, while the only person who couldn't speak for herself was her. Today's story isn't about sensational headlines. It's about how a smiling little girl became a forgotten warning until it was too late. If you care about child safety, justice, and accountability, take a moment now to subscribe. YouTube favors videos that viewers engage with, which helps this message reach more people to spread awareness. And your support helps keep these stories visible and safe to tell. It only takes a second, but it helps us tell stories that should never be buried, and it helps protect the ones who still have a chance. To all of you who have subscribed, liked, shared, or commented, you've made it possible for this channel to grow into something bigger than true crime entertainment. You've turned this space into a community that refuses to look away. You've helped build a voice for children like Kelsey, and for that, I'm truly grateful to you. Thank you so much. Please do drop a comment below with where you're watching from. It helps us know how far our messages reach. We read and deeply value every single one. Kelsey Shelton Smith-Briggs was born on December 28, 2002, in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. From the very beginning, her life was marked by tension that had nothing to do with her. Her parents, Ray Dawn Smith and Lance Briggs, were young and already unraveling as a couple. What began as a teenage relationship had quickly escalated into something far more unstable. By the time Kelsey entered the world, the relationship had already fractured beyond repair. Not long after her birth, Ray and Lance finalized their divorce. Kelsey was just a few months old. Lance, though biologically her father, soon began to disengage. There were custody exchanges, yes, but his active presence in her life was inconsistent at best. The responsibility of raising Kelsey rested almost entirely on Ray's shoulders. But even that wasn't simple. Family dynamics on both sides were fraught. Kathy Briggs, Kelsey's paternal grandmother, remained deeply involved. According to court and agency reports, she frequently raised concerns about Ray's ability to care for the child. Tensions between the maternal and paternal sides of the family began to spill into official records. Police reports were filed, accusations were exchanged, and Kelsey, barely old enough to speak, became the central figure in a quiet but escalating conflict. By early 2005, Kelsey had already been moved between several homes. At times, she lived with Ray. At others, she stayed with her grandmother Kathy, especially during periods when disputes between the adults made co-parenting nearly impossible. Despite the instability, Kelsey was described by those who knew her as bright, curious, and deeply affectionate. She loved being outside, playing dress-up, and carrying around her Cabbage Patch doll. But while her spirit shone through in public, those closest to her began noticing small things that didn't add up. In January 2005, a referral was made to the Department of Human Services. Kelsey had been taken to the emergency room with a fractured collarbone and visible bruising. The explanation given was that she had fallen from her toddler bed. But the attending physician noted inconsistencies. The injuries didn't align clearly with the reported cause. The bruising pattern raised suspicion. A formal report was filed, and DHS opened a case. At this point, Kelsey was just 2 years old. The incident triggered a chain of involvement. A child welfare specialist was assigned. Medical professionals provided statements. Photographs were taken to document the injuries. Kelsey Briggs, who had already expressed concerns, insisted that something wasn't right. She pushed for action. CASA, court-appointed special advocates, became involved to represent Kelsey's interests in court proceedings. The official narrative now included multiple voices, but none of them belonged to Kelsey. What made the case difficult, however, was the absence of a single clear suspect. While suspicions grew, there was no eyewitness account, no definitive statement pointing to intentional harm. Some officials believed the injuries could have been accidental. Others believed they were not. The legal threshold for removal was high, and in the background, a new name entered the picture. Ray had begun a relationship with a man named Michael Porter. He was a local professional, employed at a family-run business in Meeker. To those outside the home, he presented well, clean record, gainfully employed, a father himself. Ray appeared to trust him. She allowed him to spend increasing time around Kelsey. He was introduced not just as a partner, but eventually as a fixture in the household. This new relationship added another layer of complexity to Kelsey's environment. While some family members were skeptical, there were no immediate reports of harm connected to Michael Porter. But concerns continued to surface. Kelsey appeared withdrawn at times. Teachers at daycare observed moments of hesitation, quietness, and emotional reactivity that didn't quite match her usual behavior. DHS and CASA both documented that her injuries were not isolated. There had been earlier signs, faint markings, shifting explanations, subtle behavioral changes, but still. Without a clear link to a single caregiver or an official finding of abuse, the case remained open but unresolved. The truth is, by the start of 2005, the warning signs were already stacking up. Medical records showed a pattern. Observers voiced their concerns. Official files were growing thicker. Yet no one had a definitive answer to the most critical question. Who was responsible? The system had taken notice, but it hadn't yet acted. And in the middle of it all stood Kelsey, tugged between households, surrounded by suspicion, and depending on adults to read between the lines. It wasn't just the collarbone. There were abrasions, fading marks, and mounting questions. But no one knew who to blame. Not yet. In February 2005, following months of back-and-forth concern and a formal referral from medical personnel, the Oklahoma Department of Human Services took decisive action. Kelsey was removed from her mother's care and placed in the custody of her paternal grandmother, Kelsey Briggs. The decision came after escalating questions about unexplained injuries. While no definitive cause had been identified, DHS recommended that Kelsey be kept out of Ray's home until a clearer picture emerged. The goal was to protect the child while allowing time for the system to investigate. But what followed was anything but simple. Kelsey Briggs, who had been vocal in her concerns, was now Kelsey's primary caregiver. According to case documentation, she expressed strong opinions about Ray and frequently communicated with both DHS and the courts. Some professionals saw her as protective, others described her tone as combative. Still, she had custody, and that carried weight. By March, additional evaluations were underway. CASA, court-appointed special advocates, had joined the case to provide independent recommendations on Kelsey's welfare. DHS and CASA were now working side by side, but not always in agreement. While both organizations wanted to ensure Kelsey's safety, they differed on where she should be placed. DHS leaned toward extended removal from the mother. CASA, at times, saw potential for reunification with the proper safeguards in place. Then came another incident. In mid-April 2005, Kelsey was brought in for medical attention again, this time after reportedly falling during a visit with her mother. Doctors diagnosed spiral fractures in both legs. The explanation given was that she had tripped while wearing platform sandals during a trip to the zoo. It had happened days earlier, and she had continued walking for some time afterward. But once again, professionals disagreed on what had caused the injury. One physician noted that the fractures could be consistent with accidental trauma. Another believed the injuries raised significant questions. The lack of immediate care following the fall, the delayed reporting, and the location of the fractures, all of it contributed to growing uncertainty. The caseworker documented these observations. Another report was filed. At this point, DHS had logged more than 7 separate referrals on Kelsey since January alone. In May, a new placement was arranged. Kelsey was moved again, this time into the care of her maternal grandmother, Kelsey Smith. The decision came after concerns were raised about potential conflict and bias within the paternal side of the family. Kelsey was seen as a neutral party, someone who had not been directly implicated in prior disagreements and who could provide a stable environment. Throughout these transitions, Kelsey remained under supervision. DHS conducted home visits. Medical evaluations continued, and the court prepared for the next hearing, a critical one. On June 15, 2005, the case came before Associate District Judge Craig Key in Lincoln County. Multiple agencies presented their findings. DHS recommended that Kelsey remain out of Ray's home. CASA offered a different perspective, suggesting that with the right conditions, supervised visits, support services, and medical oversight, reunification could be cautiously attempted. Judge Key reviewed the full file, the medical records, the conflicting expert statements, the testimony from family members, and then he ruled. Kelsey would be returned to her mother, Ray Dawn Smith. Michael Porter, Ray's live-in partner, would be part of the household. In his decision, Judge Key cited the lack of conclusive evidence identifying who had caused the injuries. The source of harm, in his words, remained undetermined. Without a clear perpetrator and without a criminal finding, he opted to restore custody under continued DHS supervision. For some, the decision seemed fair, rooted in the principle of due process and the absence of definitive proof. But for others, particularly within DHS and among frontline observers, the ruling felt like a gamble. Because by June 2005, the signs were no longer isolated, the file showed a pattern. The referrals were increasing, and the concerns had come from multiple directions: daycare workers, emergency room doctors, agency staff, even family members on both sides. Despite this, the court ruled that the environment could be monitored, that progress could be tracked. And so Kelsey went home, back to the same house, back to the same adults, and back into the center of a system already filled with warnings. We're halfway through, but Kelsey's story is far from over. Subscribe if this already feels important, because what happens next was supposed to be preventable. Between July and October 2005, state child welfare officials maintained an active file on Kelsey Smith-Briggs. The case remained open, flagged for continued observation. Kelsey had been recently returned to the care of her mother, Ray Dawn Smith, and Ray's live-in partner, Michael Porter, under court-ordered supervision. The Department of Human Services was tasked with monitoring the situation closely. Caseworkers made regular visits to the home during this period. Each interaction was documented, each report added to the growing file. During one visit in early August, a worker noted that Kelsey appeared shy but cooperative. Another noted that she clung tightly to her toy and remained close to her mother's side throughout the visit. On paper, these moments read as minor observations, but when taken together, they began to form a pattern, subtle but increasingly hard to ignore. Outside the home, at daycare, staff began raising concerns of their own. Teachers noticed changes in Kelsey's demeanor. She had become more reserved, less eager to participate in group play. She began having difficulty with routine transitions and, on occasion, displayed behavior that teachers described as protective and withdrawn. She showed less interest in the activities she once enjoyed. Again, reports were filed by daycare professionals. Notes were made about physical appearance, mood changes, and emotional withdrawal. At times, there were mentions of noticeable fatigue. Staff described her as quieter than usual, sometimes unusually quiet. They began documenting these changes, not as isolated concerns, but as part of an emerging behavioral shift. Then, in August 2005, another incident occurred. According to official reports, Kelsey and Michael Porter were involved in a car accident. The vehicle was struck by another driver. Kelsey was in the back seat. Emergency services were called, and all parties were checked by medical staff. Though the incident was not severe and no hospitalization was required, new marks were later noted on Kelsey. Porter attributed them to the crash. This explanation was recorded in the DHS file. However, the caseworker noted that some of the markings did not align precisely with the seatbelt positioning. Medical professionals involved at the time did not dispute Porter's statement, but they made additional notes, flagging the file for follow-up. Still, the department did not move to initiate removal. The supervision order remained in place, and visits continued. In the weeks that followed, Kelsey's overall condition remained a subject of quiet concern. One report from late September described her as appearing subdued. The worker who filed the note wrote that Kelsey showed little interest in engaging with toys or speaking with visitors. Another observation described her as emotionally distant, but physically well. The reports remained cautious, uncertain, but unresolved. Then came October 11th. At approximately 12:30 p.m., a child welfare caseworker arrived at the home for a scheduled visit. Kelsey was present. She was awake and alert. The worker noted a bruise on her lower face, but was told it was the result of a fall days earlier. The mark appeared to be healing. Based on this, the worker made no changes to the care plan and scheduled the next visit for 1 week later. The interaction lasted just under an hour. The notes from that visit would be the final entry in the file. Before the emergency response, at around 3:30 p.m., Ray left the home to pick up Michael Porter's daughter from school. Kelsey remained at home in the care of Porter. At 4:15 p.m., a call was placed to 911. When responders arrived, they found Kelsey unconscious. She was transported by ambulance. Efforts to revive her were unsuccessful, and she passed away a few minutes after. There were no signs of outside interference, no evidence of forced entry. The call had come from within the home. In just under 3 hours, the situation had changed entirely. A child who had just been seen by a state worker, alive, speaking, and responsive, was now unresponsive and in critical condition. Authorities launched an immediate investigation. Medical evaluations began that same day. Statements were taken from Ray Dawn Smith and Michael Porter. The timeline between the welfare check and the emergency call became a central point of focus. Investigators began reviewing past DHS visits, daycare reports, and all documented referrals for earlier in the year. The file that had grown quietly over months now stood as a central piece of the inquiry. In retrospect, the timing was difficult to ignore. The same day Kelsey was checked on by state officials, she was rushed from the very home they had just evaluated. She was seen, she was monitored, she was watched, but she was not protected. She was gone less than 3 hours after the system said she looked safe. The official autopsy would later conclude that Kelsey's passing was the result of abdominal trauma, an internal injury caused by significant force. The findings noted that the impact was not recent, but consistent with trauma sustained within a short window prior to her collapse. Based on medical records and emergency responder timelines, the injury was estimated to have occurred shortly after 3 p.m., narrowing the time frame to when Kelsey had been alone in the home with Michael Porter. This development shifted the focus of the investigation. Both Ray Dawn Smith and Michael Porter were interviewed by law enforcement. Ray described leaving the home to pick up Porter's daughter from school. She said Kelsey had been resting when she left. Porter confirmed this, stating that Kelsey had remained in her room the entire time and that nothing unusual had happened. He insisted he had only gone to check on her when he realized she was unresponsive. But investigators found inconsistencies. The medical team noted that the level of internal trauma identified would have resulted in a rapid physical decline, not something easily missed. Records from the caseworker's visit earlier that day described Kelsey as alert, communicative, and in stable condition. This contrast became a critical part of the timeline. Investigators began asking questions about what had occurred in the 2 hours following that visit, and why no one could explain the change. Further complications arose when law enforcement reviewed Porter's behavior during questioning. While he denied causing harm, investigators later obtained digital communication suggesting Porter had told his daughter not to speak about what happened in the home. The message wasn't direct, but it was enough to raise flags. Authorities interpreted it as an attempt to control the narrative. Law enforcement also reviewed Michael Porter's background. There were no prior convictions, no active complaints. On paper, he had presented as a stable figure. But those who had observed Kelsey in his presence reported subtle changes in her behavior over time. Withdrawn expressions, a reluctance to engage, and physical tension. Those reports now took on new weight. Porter's interview with detectives continued over several sessions. He maintained that Kelsey's condition had nothing to do with his actions. But as additional forensic analysis came in, gaps in the timeline became harder to explain. Medical experts concluded that the injury was not consistent with an accident. It would have required significant force, and it would have triggered symptoms almost immediately. 8 days after the incident, on October 20th, 2005, Michael Porter was formally arrested. The charge was enabling harm to a child. The decision not to pursue more severe charges was based on the available evidence at the time, which remained circumstantial. No direct witness had come forward. There were no confessions. And although the forensic indicators pointed to a clear time of injury, they did not provide a definitive source. This left investigators in a difficult position. They had a child whose condition deteriorated during a narrow window of time. They had medical experts confirming that her condition could not have gone unnoticed. They had statements that didn't align, but they did not yet have enough to bring a murder charge. As the case continued to unfold, attention turned not just to what happened, but to how it was allowed to happen. The decision to return Kelsey to the household. The caseworker's visit hours before the emergency call. The warning signs that had been filed, read, and ultimately left unresolved. And at the center of it all stood Michael Porter, under arrest but not yet fully accountable. The case was gaining public attention, and the legal process was just beginning. But the courts didn't charge him with murder, and her mother's trial was still to come. In the months that followed Michael Porter's arrest, the legal process turned toward accountability. The focus was now split between Porter, who had been in the home during the critical time frame, and Ray Dawn Smith, Kelsey's biological mother, who had left Kelsey in his care. Michael Porter ultimately entered a plea agreement. Rather than proceed to a full trial, he accepted a conviction for enabling harm to a child. The court sentenced him to 30 years in prison. The plea avoided a drawn-out courtroom battle but left many questions unanswered. There was no formal admission of direct action, no detailed testimony revealing what had taken place in those final hours. The public would not hear a complete explanation. Legally, Porter took responsibility for what happened, but the deeper details remained sealed. Meanwhile, charges were filed against Ray Dawn Smith. Prosecutors argued that she had allowed her daughter to remain in an unsafe environment, despite prior concerns. The charge was not centered on a single moment, but rather a pattern, a repeated failure to act on warning signs that had become increasingly visible. They contended that Ray had been informed of potential issues, that she had been advised to take precautions, and that she had ignored or dismissed them. Her defense team pushed back. They pointed to her cooperation with child welfare services. They argued that she had followed court orders, allowed home inspections, and sought medical care when necessary. They emphasized that she had no prior criminal history and no documented record of mistreatment. Most significantly, they underscored that she had not been present at the time Kelsey's condition deteriorated. The trial moved forward in mid-2007. Witnesses included agency staff, healthcare professionals, and family members. Prosecutors presented a timeline of referrals, hospital records, and caseworker notes to establish a broader pattern. They suggested that Ray's trust in Michael Porter, despite multiple referrals and growing concern, had placed her daughter at risk. Supporters of Ray argued that she had been caught between conflicting opinions, that some doctors believed the injuries were accidental, that child services had, at multiple points, allowed Kelsey to return home, that Ray had followed the same system the state now accused her of defying. On July 18, 2007, the jury delivered its verdict. Ray Dawn Smith was found guilty of enabling harm to a child and sentenced to 27 years in prison. The conviction drew national attention. Debate surrounding the fairness of the sentence grew rapidly, especially given that Michael Porter had already accepted a 30-year term without trial. Supporters believed Ray had been misled by a system that was supposed to help her. Others argued that failing to protect a child, especially in the face of documented warning signs, carried its own kind of weight. Inside the family, the divisions deepened. Kelsey Briggs, Kelsey's paternal grandmother, and Lance Briggs, her biological father, pursued a civil case against the state of Oklahoma. Their claim alleged negligence by agencies tasked with protecting Kelsey. The legal filing pointed to missed opportunities, delayed interventions, and decisions that ultimately placed the child in danger. After extended litigation, the state settled. A payment of $625,000 was awarded in response to the oversight acknowledged during the investigation. But for many involved, no settlement could resolve the deeper questions. The courts had issued their sentences. The agencies had reviewed their policies. Yet those closest to Kelsey remained divided over what was missed, who was responsible, and what it meant to fail a child without ever laying a hand. 2 people were convicted, but only one of them had been in the room. In the aftermath of the trials, public attention turned toward the larger system, the network of professionals, agencies, and legal standards that had intersected in Kelsey Smith-Briggs' life. Her case wasn't just a tragedy, it became a rallying point. And in 2006, just 1 year after her passing, the Oklahoma State Legislature responded. The Kelsey Smith-Briggs Child Protection Reform Act was signed into law with bipartisan support. It was intended to close the gaps exposed during the case. Among its most significant provisions were requirements for improved judicial training in child welfare matters and expanded access for child protective services to criminal background information across state lines. The law also allowed child welfare officials to access sealed records under certain court orders, records that in Kelsey's case might have changed how custody decisions were made. Supporters of the legislation pointed to a breakdown in communication between the courts and investigative agencies. Others highlighted the absence of a unified database that could have flagged concerns more quickly. The Reform Act wasn't positioned as a fix-all, but it was a start, an acknowledgement that the process as it stood in 2005 had failed. As the state began implementing reforms, others attempted to build on Kelsey's name in more personal ways. Kelsey Briggs, Kelsey's paternal grandmother, established a nonprofit foundation bearing Kelsey's name. The organization stated its purpose as raising awareness and supporting efforts to prevent child endangerment. For a time, the foundation received support from members of the community and raised funds through public events and online donations. But questions later arose over how the money was being used. In response, the Oklahoma Attorney General's office issued a cease and desist order, citing irregularities in the foundation's operations. The nonprofit was eventually shut down. Official records indicated misuse of charitable funds, though no criminal charges were filed. Meanwhile, Ray Dawn Smith remained incarcerated. In the years that followed her conviction, she completed a series of educational programs while serving her sentence. She earned multiple degrees, maintained a clean disciplinary record, and began working through the state's rehabilitation system. According to prison officials, she met all eligibility requirements for sentence commutation under Oklahoma's standard review process. In 2024, nearly 2 decades after Kelsey's passing, Ray filed a formal clemency request with the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board. Her appeal cited good behavior, educational achievement, and time served. She expressed remorse for what had occurred, but maintained that she had not knowingly placed her daughter in danger. The clemency request reignited the case publicly. Kelsey's father, Lance Briggs, and other members of her paternal family spoke out strongly against the request. In a hearing before the parole board, Lance stated that Kelsey's voice had already been silenced and that allowing early release would send the wrong message. He said she had second chances. Kelsey didn't. His testimony was supported by statements from prosecutors and community advocates who had followed the case from the beginning.
Most of the jurors stated afterwards that they had been given the opportunity of a murder charge, they would have convicted her of it.
On June 5, 2024, the board issued its decision. Ray's clemency petition was denied.
When Smith was given unsupervised visitation, Kelsey suffered from 2 spiral fractured broken legs. This type of abuse required an adult to twist her legs.
In addition to numerous bruises all over and about her face, head, and body. Kelsey's death would have been painful, it would have been torturous.
The board acknowledged her conduct in custody, but emphasized the seriousness of the case and the irreversible outcome. Still, the case continues to echo beyond courtrooms and legislative halls. For some, Kelsey's name represents a failure to act. For others, it marks a moment where awareness turned into reform. But no matter the perspective, one thing is certain. Even in 2025, the fight over Kelsey's justice isn't over. The case of Kelsey Smith-Briggs left behind more than a timeline and a courtroom record. It left questions about judgment, about accountability, and about how many chances the system should get before it recognizes the cost of inaction. By the time Kelsey was removed from her last home, multiple professionals had raised concerns. Reports had been filed. Medical evaluations had been conducted. Caseworkers had visited. Judges had ruled. Yet through every level of oversight, key moments were missed. Opportunities to intervene were met with hesitation, contradiction, or deferral. Medical findings were questioned, red flags were reinterpreted, and agency recommendations were debated in courtrooms without a clear consensus. The pattern wasn't just one of oversight, it was fragmentation, a lack of coordination between agencies, a failure to unify information from doctors, teachers, caseworkers, and guardians, and a legal process that often treated risk as theoretical. Until it wasn't. Kelsey's case revealed how quickly decisions could shift, depending on who was reviewing the file. One report might recommend caution. Another might advise leniency. The absence of a centralized view created space for error. And in that space, critical time was lost. In response, new laws were passed. The state of Oklahoma introduced reforms that reshaped how child welfare cases are handled. Kelsey's law improved access to sealed records, ensuring that courts and agencies no longer operated in silos. CASA standards were revised to strengthen training and case review procedures. The aim was to tighten the margins so that uncertainty no longer came at a child's expense. But legal reform isn't enough on its own, because systems don't protect children, people do. And that responsibility doesn't rest solely with courts or agencies. It rests with every adult who sees something that doesn't sit right and chooses to act, with every teacher who notices a behavioral shift, with every healthcare professional who asks a second question, and with every community member who refuses to look away. Modern vigilance means understanding that signs of distress aren't always loud. Sometimes they're quiet. Behavioral changes, emotional withdrawal, hesitation in the presence of certain individuals. These signals rarely come with explanations, but they come with consequences when ignored. No law, no agency, no courtroom can undo what happened to Kelsey. But every time her name is spoken, every time her case is studied, taught, or remembered, it becomes more than a headline. It becomes a lesson, a reminder that silence can be dangerous, and that awareness, when combined with action, is the most powerful form of protection we have. If you made it this far, you care. Subscribe, comment, and share this story to help protect the next Kelsey, because silence isn't safety. Awareness is.